Let's start with those Houston Texans. For all of these teams, if you guys have not listened to the other previews, we're doing their offseason in 60 seconds, trying to run through all the moves they made over the last 6 or so months. For Houston, extensions for Nico Collins, Dalton Schultz, Cami Fairburn, Jimmy Ward. Nico Collins gets a huge contract after the season that he had last year. Brought in Danielle Hunter on a 2-year, $49 million deal, 48 of that guaranteed. It's a very good job by Danielle Hunter. He's on the Laramie Tunsil School of NFL finance. Azeez Al-Shaair, 3 years, $34 million. Denico Autry comes over on a 2-year deal. He's obviously suspended for the first 6 games of the year. Tim Settle, Foley Fatukasi, and Jeff Okuda on smaller deals. Traded for Stephon Diggs, which is a monstrous move by this team. Acquired Joe Mixon and then signed him to a 3-year extension that I don't totally understand. Lost Jonathan Grenard, Sheldon Rankins, Blake Cashman, Devin Singletary, and George Fant in free agency. Draft picks drafted Kamari Lassiter in the 2nd round, Blake Fisher in the 2nd round, safety Kalen Bullock in the 3rd round. For all of these teams, we're doing a blue chip check-in. The way that we're doing this is just kind of going through the roster and figuring out how many blue chip players are on each of these teams, because too often I think we've gone through these previews in the past and not mentioned the good players because there's not a lot of uncertainty about what they are or what they will be. So your blue chip check-in for the Texans, how many did you land on?
3 for sure, 2 probably, and then one other one I think I'm going to give it to, which is, so the first 3 are obviously CJ Stroud. That one's an easy one. Nico Collins, I think, ascended into that territory last year.
Yeah.
Laramie Tunsil has been in there for a very long time. Stephon Diggs, the end of last year was weird, but on body of work, probably still plenty fine to give it to him. Danielle Hunter is kind of in the same category where maybe he's not quite like the peak edge rusher, but he's close enough in this tier that I'm willing to give it to him. The other one for me is Derek Stingley. How many cornerbacks are like definitively better than Derek Stingley? I think you can probably count them on your hand, and I'm willing to give a guy blue chip if that's where I'm landing.
I'm wait and see mode on Derek Stingley. I think the flashes are intoxicating. I think that he had enough moments, and I know he was banged up last year. I think that you can ascribe a lot of that to him being banged up early in the season. There was enough up and down moments in the first half of last year where I just want to wait and see a little bit. There's a chance by like week 3 of this year, we're just putting him in the top tier of corners in the NFL. But there's a smidge more that I have to see before I'm willing to put it there.
I think given his health, that's fair. I think it's completely fair. I just think the talent is just intoxicating for me.
He was outrageous, and some his best moments are as good as anybody in the league at that position, and I hope we see more of them this year. And if we do, then good Lord, this team gets very scary in a hurry. On the second tier of this, I think Tank Dell is an awesome player. Like he's going to be overlooked because of the name recognition and the talent that they have at those other receiver spots. I love Tank Dell. Will Anderson, 100% an ascending guy. I think he's going to take a step forward this year. I had Stingley in there, and I think Shaq Mason is still a really good player. And the fact that they got him for pretty much nothing a couple of years ago, and he's now part of this contending team. The long story short here, there is a lot of talent on this roster at pretty much every single level.
A lot of good players. I love me a Will Anderson too. He was one of those guys where I think, kind of like you just said with Stingley, I think by the first month of next season, I will probably be okay with saying he's blue chip, but it's like, he was a rookie. Let's see a little bit more.
Yeah, but 5, even if we're not being generous and we're giving them 5, that's a lot when you compare it to the other teams that we've done this for. So this team is in very good shape. As kind of an offset to the blue chip check-in, we've done what significant question marks are on this step chart, because there are some teams, we'll talk about one of them a little bit later, like the Colts. They don't necessarily have that many elite guys, but I think they have serviceable players at most of these positions. As you're looking at the Texans specifically, what question marks do you think exist on this step chart?
This is a roster with a lot of flash and a lot of guys in the right spots. You've got a great tackle. You've got a great quarterback. You've got pass catchers. You have a corner who might be a superstar. You've got obviously incredible edge rushers now. Both of the middle of the lines are a little bit questionable. And that doesn't even mean just the starters. Like, I think even the depth on the defensive line is kind of a big concern for me. And maybe
especially without Autry.
Yes, exactly. And maybe saying depth as a glaring weakness is kind of like, well, the rest of the roster is pretty good if that's where you're at, but I still think it's a genuine concern.
We've done this a bunch, though. When we get into this tier of teams where you're trying to get to championship weekend or maybe beyond that, you have to start nitpicking about where some of the weaknesses are. I'm not going to talk about the interior defensive line depth for the Patriots because I don't really think that matters for a team with the Patriots aspirations. For a team that has the Texans aspirations, those are the things that you kind of have to drill down on.
I think that's absolutely right.
And I'm same boat with me. Also, I think interior offensive line you can look at. Juice Scruggs going to be a full-time starter at center this year. Play a little bit of guard last year. Kenyon Green comes back from injury. So we're nitpicking a little bit, but again, I think that's where this team is and where they're trying to get. What are you watching in the first month of the season with the Texans? This is the first question we're asking about pretty much all these teams. Essentially, the biggest question you have heading into the season and what you want some quick answers on.
So the wide receiver core is really good, right? You obviously Nico Collins is fantastic. Stephon Diggs, assuming the end of last year was just kind of an anomaly, and then Tank Dell is really good. Two of those guys are not really tough. They're not really blockers. They're not really just that style of player. And this is an offense that is typically going to ask a lot of you in that regard. So I'm kind of just wondering, what is the snap count rotation actually going to look like when you consider guys like John Mechie and Robert Woods are a little bit more willing and capable of doing some of the dirty work that you're going to need to do over the middle. So obviously they're going to want to feed those top three receivers. It's just a matter of, I guess, outside of Nico, I think is going to play every single snap for as many as he can. It's just a matter of how much do we get of the other two versus some of the more consistent veteran type BS that you're going to get from the older guys.
I was interested to see them cut Andrew Beck this week, who was their starting fullback last year. And this team used 21 personnel at one of the highest clips in the league last season. They still have a fullback on the roster. It's Brooks something, who's an undrafted free agent. So I assume they'll still lean into that stuff because that's just the DNA of this offense. But I'm with you. I'm curious like how the personnel shakes out and how they want to live. And even going beyond the snap counts, like where do these guys line up? Like, is Stephon Diggs going to be a primarily slot player? Because Tank Dell, even if he's undersized, that's not his game. Like, he is an explosive vertical player outside the numbers, and Nico Collins is about as X-receiver-ish as it gets these days in the NFL. So how the roles actually unfold when their three best receivers are on the field together, that's something that I'm curious about.
Diggs is going to be kind of the X factor there. It feels like how willing is he to play a ton out of the slot, and let Dell kind of do what he does outside of the numbers. So that's definitely the big X factor.
It's funny to me because they tried to trade for Keenan Allen. And even if I think Stephon Diggs is a better player than Keenan Allen with these other two guys actually makes more sense to my brain than Stephon Diggs, because even if he has played inside a little bit, that's not where he's done his best work in the NFL. Like him outside the numbers on comebacks and hitches and vertical routes, like for the most part, that's where he's made his hay over the last 3 or 4 years. He's a slightly less explosive player now, so there's a chance that a move inside actually benefits him long term, but it's just not a one-to-one easy drop it in like it would be with someone like Keenan Allen.
That's why, in general, I am a little bit more curious about how the Diggs thing works out, just because that on top of how the end of last year went, it's a little, I think, less of a guarantee than maybe a lot of people seem to think.
What I'm watching the first month of the season is just, can this offense find early down efficiency to go with their explosiveness? It was funny. I was at Texans practice the first week of August. I talked to multiple different people on the offensive staff, and the degree to which they were just penciling in like, oh, we know we'll be explosive. Like, we just don't have to worry about that. And if you look at it, there are only two teams in the NFL last year that were more explosive throwing the ball last season were the Dolphins and the Niners. That was it. This team was extremely explosive through the air, but they were not good on early downs when it came to just success and efficiently moving the ball. They were 13th in dropback success rate overall, but outside the top 10, and they were 23rd in early down rushing success rate. And when you combine that with the team that ran the ball a decent clip on early downs, they were 16th in their total early down runs last year. You had a team that was in pretty shitty down and distance situations a little bit too often and really was kind of hampered by what their early down efficiency looked like, both throwing and running. So how can they balance some of that efficiency with the explosiveness this year? Because I think that is the way that this offense can go from being an interesting unit that does a lot of fun things to a team that is truly one of the elite offenses in the league.
It's a boring answer, but you just have to get better at running the ball. How they figure out how to do that and how they get there, what run calls they're doing, I don't really know, and I don't really care. It's just that the sacrifice with this type of offense is that you're going to have to run the ball at a higher clip than most other offenses, because that's how you get the explosives, is by coaxing teams into be like, all right, we have to keep Aiden and all that other stuff. So how they get there, I have some degree of faith in the players and the coaching staff. We just have to see it.
I think it's twofold. One, you just hope that better health luck along the offensive line helps get you there, because they were able to piece that group together last year, but it was I think Football Outsiders had it as the most injured offensive line we've seen in modern NFL history. They're slotting guys into random roles. And again, Drew Scruggs is playing guard. And so it's hard to live that way. And I also just think that they're going to try everything as far as run schemes go. This was a team that ran a lot of gap scheme runs last year, despite the Shanahan DNA of where Bobby Slowick comes from. But we're talking to people there, it really did seem like we need to get better at outside zone. Like we want to lean on that. And obviously, based on his history and based on the history of some of the other guys on that staff, that makes sense. They were 30th in the NFL in EPA per rush on outside zone last year, according to SIS. And they ran the 12th most outside zone plays in the league. That just doesn't square. Like if you're going to run it that often, you have to be better at it. And that's such a detail-oriented run. And not having consistent guys in there to kind of hammer down on those details, I think ultimately came back to hurt them. So if they can just get more consistent play and work with the same 5 guys over and over and over again, can they just get average on those runs? And what does that mean for the rest of the offense?
And with this offense, you have to be great at that first, because we've applauded both Kyle Shanahan and Sean McVay for kind of adapting and moving into this more gap scheme run game. But it's because they were S tier elite, the best we've ever seen at running this zone type of stuff. Like it afforded them the freedom to kind of go and dive into those waters. It seemed like Slowick kind of dove in head first and didn't actually have the foundation of being a great zone team, which again, I'm not saying it's like all his fault or anything. They had a ton of offensive line injuries, but you kind of have to have that foundation first, it feels like.
I also think that there's a layer to Stroud's game that he needs to find as far as just finding easy completions throughout games. And they talked about that. There was we need to stack together completions in ways that we didn't last year. And it's hard because you don't want to tamp down his aggressiveness, because his willingness to hang on and hunt out some of those throws is part of what makes him special. But if you look at the best players in the league, like Mahomes, even Josh Allen to an extent now, they're finding easy completions consistently. It's not defanging your very aggressive, talented quarterback to ask him to look for more easy completions more often. It's just a feature of being an elite quarterback, is that you're consistently stringing positive plays together. So I think that's one small area where even if we're really excited about Stroud, a half step forward right there would go a long way in just helping lift this offense overall and just make everything feel easier.
I think that's absolutely right. And I will say that to me is one of those things where if he doesn't get all the way there in year 2, I'm not gonna, hurt him too bad for it.
It's
Like
gonna be
he's
okay.
gonna have a decade to figure this out. Like it's gonna be fine.
Yeah, but Patrick Mahomes was not like a crazy check down artist in his first or second year as a quarterback in the NFL, and especially in year 1. You look at that offense and they're just slinging it all over the yard. And because of the talent that they had at quarterback and at those pass catching spots, it ended up being okay. For each of these teams is kind of the other side of the coin with what we're looking for in the first month. What is keeping you up at night, and what might be worrying you about this Houston Texans team?
So I think there's a lot to be excited about on the defense with some of the stars, but we kind of mentioned earlier the depth to me is a little bit scary, especially along the interior. I don't think they have a ton of great guys at the defensive tackle position. Even the edge spot is not all, like they still have Jerry Hughes on the roster, and look, Jerry Hughes was a really good automatic 6 to 8 sacks guy for a long time. Not sure he really has that in him anymore, and I hate
How
to say
old
that,
is Jerry Hughes now?
dude. I don't know, but
He's 30. He's 36. He just
yeah.
turned 36, so he's like a year younger than me. Good for Jerry Hughes, man.
That's with Jerry Hughes. I remember 2 or 3 years ago being like, he can still really get you 7 sacks, huh? That's crazy. And then he's still on a roster, which is not, again, not a great spot you want to be if you have the aspirations of making this deep playoff run and being this real ascending team. And then even at the safety spot, like if Petrie's going to move more to the nickel, how's that going to go? So I just think some of the depth spots, if they have 1 or 2 things that go wrong, they could have some holes in this defense.
Yeah, and I think the interior of the defensive line is definitely something else to mention. Like we're looking at Mario Edwards there as a starter, and I thought Mario Edwards was a pretty good rotational piece, an underrated rotational piece at multiple different stops over the last 3 or 4 years. But when he's your starting defensive tackle or one of them on a team that's trying to win the Super Bowl, there are concerns there. What I will say about that, though, Kurt Hinish and Khalil Davis played a combined 400 rundown snaps for this team last year. Do you know who either of those people are?
I do know Khalil Davis. Kurt Hinish, I'm not quite as familiar with his game.
Okay, I'm just probably eschewing my professional responsibility, not knowing who either of those people are, but I'm going to admit that I don't. This team was still 4th in early down run defense success rate. Even slotting those types of guys into the rotation. And Malik Collins and Sheldon Rankins are good players that were sought out this offseason by contending teams, but they're not like big-bodied run stuffers. Like that's not what their game is. And this team was still excellent defending the run. And so I think that their solution to a lot of these problems is we're going to solve this stuff with violence. Like that is how we're going to solve these problems. And it does work for the most part. So if there is an ecosystem and a system in general defensively that I would bet on to kind of overcome some personnel concerns just because of play style reasons, DeMeco Ryans and this sort of team is probably where I would look first.
You don't have to convince me. Listen, if I have to say that depth on one or two defensive spots is the biggest issue I have with this roster, you're probably in a really good spot. Like of the, all the glaring holes that we've done and what's keeping you up at night for every team that we've done so far, this ranks pretty low on the list. So not a huge deal, but still something to think about.
Mine's on defense too. Essentially just like, can the secondary come together fast enough for the rest of this to matter? You have 2 guys as rookies that are probably going to start for you. Like you mentioned, if they do play Petrie at the nickel, which I love, I just think it gives you such like a crazy, weird attitude to this defense. That means that you're going to have Kamari Lassiter at one outside cornerback spot and Kalen Bullock at one of those safety spots in your starting nickel personnel. That's a lot of youth for a team that wants to win a Super Bowl. It can absolutely come together. And if the front can lift you by week 12, because you get Autry back and it's Autry and it's Hunter and it's Will Anderson and that group is just dominating, fine. But you're still relying on 2 unproven guys to start for you when you want to win a championship. And that's always going to come with a decent amount of risk. By all accounts, Lassiter specifically has looked really, really good. We talked about this in our top 10 defenses show. Like he's not getting run by, he's physical, he plays with attitude, all those things. But rookies are rookies. They can look good in the preseason and they can still have their moments as we get into the games that actually matter.
Lassiter is one of those. I don't know if I'm just too bought in on DeMeco Ryans, but when he says he believes in a guy, I buy it like almost instantly. And so he seems pretty bought in on Kamari Lassiter.
What are you most excited about as you look forward to watching the Texans this year? Again, doing this for every single team.
Well, speaking of DeMeco Ryans' defense, if a lot of these guys stay healthy and if the interior defensive line isn't maybe the problem that it could be, this defense could go nuclear. We didn't have him. I think I had him, 9th, 10th on my list or something on the defensive show. So I didn't think super, super highly of them. But there is a chance where this goes absolutely insane. There's a chance that Will Anderson jumps into the double-digit sack guy that he can be. Danielle Hunter obviously has that in his game. Azeez Al-Shire is a very obvious upgrade at the linebacker position for them. If Stingley stays healthy and plays like a top 5 corner, if Petrie's move to the nickel makes him a better player, if Kalen Bullock is a useful safety, which, again, if DeMeco Ryans is willing to put a rookie on the field, I'm probably going to buy it. And so I'm willing to buy it with him and Lassiter. So there's a chance that this starting 11 is absolutely insane.
It sounds like Christian Harris, I think he's on IR, designated to return. He's dealt with like some soft tissue injuries throughout camp. He's one of their starting linebackers, has been for a couple of years. You drop him out of there and you put like Henry Toto into that spot. How do you feel about the linebacking core, even with Al-Shire there, if Harris is going to miss extended time? These are the questions that I just reserved for you.
Coverage-wise, not great, because Azeez Al-Shire is pretty good at he can kind of play what's in front of him, but as far as, some of the eyes in the back of your head and covering a ton of hook space, the way that I was talking about with Jordan Brooks, or obviously what you get out of Fred Warner and all those guys, not really his game. Whereas Harris at least actually had like flashes of that. It wasn't necessarily consistent, but there were moments where he could do that. Henry To'o doesn't really have that in his bag to me. And then as a run defender, he almost like I talked about with Alex Singleton, there's an element of like where his body and everything is happening so fast, but he's not actually doing that many productive things. He's just kind of running at the ball. There's an element of that. So I'm probably a little bit less bullish, but I don't know. I think if the other star players are as good as I think they will be, it'll probably be okay.
For me, what I'm most excited about, I cannot wait to watch this team just sling the ball all around the yard. I mean, you drop Nico Collins, Tank Dell, and Stephon Diggs. And even Dalton Schultz. Dalton Schultz is like a perfectly serviceable NFL tight end, and that's actually like a pretty damn good pass catcher.
If he's your 4th guy instead of like at times being Dallas's 2nd, or even at times with some injuries last year with Houston, like yeah, he's a really good player to have.
And we talked about this a little bit, just the role for Diggs and how the weirdness of that. Not weirdness necessarily in a bad way, but I think there's something that you have to shake out. But when you think about Collins and Dell, one of my favorite parts about them is that they have perfectly complementary skill sets. Where Collins is just like this big inbreaker, just monster body on these like short posts and deep digs. And not only does he have a massive catch radius, he is so good after the catch for a dude who's 6'4", 220. Like, it's absolutely wild. The complementary skill sets with him and Stroud are so great because Stroud's ball placement combined with the way that Collins plays, it's beautiful. Like, it's just like this gorgeous marriage when you watch it in real time, because Collins, despite coming into the league, is kind of like a raw, toolsy guy. He has great hands. Like, he's consistently plucking the ball out of the air. And because Stroud is always putting it exactly where it needs to, he was third in the NFL at 6'4", 220 in yak over expected last year. The only two guys ahead of him were Debo and Puka.
I mean, that checks out, though. And think about the body types of those two guys. They're thick players who are really, really explosive, like more than they should be for that size. And yeah, so Nico absolutely fits into that bucket.
I mean, you just watch it. Every single time he catches one of those digs, even if it's in traffic, he gets like 4.5, 5 more yards than he should. And you combine that with some of the real catch and runs, and he's just such a dynamic player. And then you take Tank Dell, and I think Tank Dell is like one of the best outside the numbers, outbreaking route receivers in the NFL right now, full stop. Like, it doesn't really matter that he weighs 166 pounds. They did such a good job of shielding him from press coverage last year and keeping him off the line of scrimmage. I was looking at the reception perception numbers. He had one of the highest success rates on like corners and outbreakers last year of any player in the league. Not rookies, any player in the league. And Bobby Slowick, I was talking to him when I was there, and he just said, I've been around very, very few people who have the in and out of break talent that he has. And so that, if you have him on those like big outbreakers and Nico on those big inbreakers, like those two skill sets with Stroud is just beautiful. Like, it is one of my favorite things to watch on an NFL field right now. And going into year 2 of this, when they're all like a little bit more comfortable, and now you're dropping Stephon Diggs into that, I'm so pumped. Like, I just cannot wait to watch this team play.
And with Dell too, if you remember CJ Stroud at Ohio State, it felt like 40% of his draft profile was throwing those like 12-yard outs that Ohio State just absolutely spammed. So CJ will throw the shit out of those routes. And if Dell is open on them with 2 yards of separation every time, it feels like you're just stealing money. Like, it just feels like it's free.
Yeah, and the fact that they're really like attacking vertical plays too, because of how much vertical push he gets and how explosive he is. I'm excited to see what his role looks like this year. I think we're going to see him in motion a little bit more because he has like the body control stuff to do some of those things that like a Tyreek Hill does, where you have him in full speed motions, but he's actually running real routes from that rather than just doing clear out stuff. So I'm just excited to see what the year 2 iteration of this is. And oh yeah, Stephon Diggs is also part of that. Most important supporting character in your mind for this year's Texans team is?
We talked about both sides of the interior already, so I think one, it's got to be Juice Scruggs moving to center now. He played guard last year, which was, I don't think, by most evaluators' opinion, where he was supposed to play coming out of college.
Not sure it was part of the plan.
Not part of the plan. And so, he did what he could when he had to play there. But now that he's moving to his more natural spot at center, I'm excited and kind of curious to see how much better he can improve that spot for them. And then Folorunso Fatu Kasi playing interior defensive line for them. Like 2-3 years ago, he seemed like a player who really was kind of like hot on the market and teams. He was going to be one of those
cashed in with the Jags.
Yeah. He was one of those guys where it seems like every offseason there's one nose tackle who gets a lot of money by a team that's like, dude, we have to fix this so bad. And he was that guy a couple years ago. I don't know if his star shines quite the same that it did at that time. So I'm just curious to see if he can kind of get back closer to that level.
I'm going with Scruggs and Kenyon Green, just because I think if they can shore up the interior of that offensive line and you compare those with really, really good players at 2 of the other 3 spots, and Titus Howard, when he's healthy, is perfectly serviceable at that other right tackle spot. If this can be like a top 8-ish offensive line and they can be an average or slightly above average running team, holy shit. Like, think about what this offense could potentially be. And I think those 2 guys on the interior, they're going to have a huge role in whether or not they can get to that level as a team.
Yeah, CJ Stroud was great at throwing under pressure. It would be great if he just didn't have to quite as often.
Sure. What counts as a successful season in your mind for the Houston Texans?
Firstly, more convincingly win the division because obviously it ran down to the wire last year. And that's not like a negative. Obviously, they were not. I think going in, nobody thought they were going to win the division. So great for them for being able to do it. And then I think AFC title game. I'm like of two minds where I think this is a team that if everything goes right, they can be in the AFC title game. And with a quarterback like this, they should be striving for it. But I'm also like, hey man, it's only year 2 of this guy, and you know he's the guy. Like we don't need to feel like we have to rush into this thing. So I guess it's just as long as they feel like a team that's going to be there all the time.
I think that's fair on some level. It is year 2. We do think he's going to be around for a long time. I think he is one of the next dudes that's just going to be in that conversation a lot. I've said that multiple times this offseason. I believe it with conviction. But some of the moves that they made over this offseason, they're not long-term moves. Like Danielle Hunter's here for 2 years. Stephon Diggs is here for 1 year. So a lot of their swings and their asset allocation this offseason, I think, was in mind of like trying to push this thing as far as they can in the short term while also understanding they're probably set up for the long term. So I think getting to the AFC Championship game when you've had that mindset over the last 6 months, I think that is what success should feel like for this team.
No, that's a good point. Maybe they're in the because we know he's the guy. Let's try to get the most out of not having to pay him a ton.
I think that's exactly where they're at.
In 2 years,
their actions will tell you that.
Yeah.
And again, the 2 years for Hunter, I mean, that's the deal that other teams weren't willing to do because it was such a short-term deal. But if this team believes it can win a Super Bowl in the next 2 seasons, I want to see them get at least close this year to potentially build on that in 2025.